The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in strokes of orange and gold, when a sleek private jet descended quietly onto the runway of the King estate. And one knew it was coming. No calls, no emails, no announcements. Inside the jet sat Ethan King, a man the world admired but few truly knew. Billionaire, CEO, genius investor. Yet, in that very moment, he wasn't thinking about business. He was thinking about home. For the past 5 years, Ethan had lived a life most people only dream of: luxurious mansions in foreign countries, private yachts, gala dinners with the world's elite. But somewhere along that glittering path, he had lost something priceless: connection. His father, Robert King, had been the one who taught him everything: hard work, kindness, humility. But when his health started to fade, Ethan buried himself in his empire instead of being by his side. Now, after half a decade, something inside him whispered that it was time to return, and so, without warning anyone, he did. As the jet came to a halt, the door opened with a hiss. The night breeze hit his face, cool, familiar, and oddly emotional. Ethan stepped out, his expensive shoes tapping softly on the tarmac. The air smelled of earth and pine, the same scent he grew up with. He inhaled deeply, whispering to himself, "Home." The driver, who had been waiting, unaware of who he was supposed to pick up, jumped in surprise as the billionaire approached. "Mr. King? I wasn't told you were coming, sir." Ethan gave a faint smile. "That's exactly how I wanted it." Within minutes, the black Rolls-Royce glided through the enormous iron gates of the King estate, a mansion that looked more like a palace than a home. Dozens of lights glimmered from the tall windows, reflecting against the marble fountain in the front yard. Everything looked perfect, almost too perfect, but something felt off. When he was younger, the house was always alive. He could still remember laughter echoing from the kitchen, his father reading newspapers in the garden, the sound of birds, the warmth of people. But now, as the car rolled to a stop and the engine went silent, the mansion stood still. No sound, no movement. "Strange," Ethan muttered, stepping out. "Not even the guards greeted me." He pushed open the grand wooden doors himself. The hinges creaked, echoing through the vast hallway like a whisper of the past. The scent of lavender polish filled the air. Someone had cleaned recently, but there was no trace of life. He walked through the hallway slowly, his footsteps echoing. Every painting on the wall seemed to stare at him, reminding him of the years he'd been gone. His mother's portrait still hung above the fireplace, smiling gently, frozen in time. That he whispered to the empty room, "You'd be disappointed in me, Mom." Ethan's mind raced with questions. Where was everyone? The house had a staff of 10: cooks, gardeners, maids, nurses. He had hired them himself to make sure his father was comfortable while he was away. And most importantly, where was his father? He headed toward the study, his father's favorite room. The door was half open, a faint light spilling through the crack. "Dad?" he called softly. No answered. He pushed the door open a little more, careful not to make a sound. And that's when he saw something that made his entire world pause. There, in the warm glow of the lamp, his father sat in an old armchair, wrapped in a blanket. His once strong frame looked frail, his hands thin and trembling. Beside him, kneeling on the floor, was a woman, the maid, Grace. Ethan blinked. Grace? She'd been with the family for years, quiet, humble, always wearing a gentle smile. But now she looked different, tired, her eyes puffy from sleepless nights. And what she was doing broke Ethan's composure. She was holding a bowl of soup, spooning it gently toward his father's mouth. Her voice trembled as she said softly, "Please, Mr. Robert, just one more spoon. You need to eat something." When his father refused, she took the spoon herself, blew on it, and carefully pressed it to his lips again. The sight froze Ethan where he stood. His father, a man of pride and power, being hand-fed by the maid like a helpless child. And the maid, instead of acting like an employee, cared for him like a daughter would for her dying parent. Tears ran down Grace's cheeks as she whispered, "You promised you'd eat, sir. You said you'd get better before Mr. Ethan came home." Ethan's breath caught. Before Mr. Ethan came home. Those words cut through him. Without realizing, he stepped closer. The sound of his shoes tapping the floor made Grace flinch. The spoon dropped from her trembling hand. The bowl almost tipped over. "And Mr. Ethan," she stammered, her voice shaking. His father slowly lifted his head. His eyes, cloudy yet full of warmth, met his son's. A faint smile formed on his lips. "Ethan, you came back." Ethan opened his mouth but couldn't find words. His throat felt tight. Grace quickly stood up, wiping her tears, trying to compose herself. I I didn't know you'd be back, sir. Forgive me. I was just—" Ethan interrupted coldly, his voice low but sharp. "What's going on here? Why are you feeding him like that? Where are the nurses I hired?" Grace froze. Her eyes lowered to the floor. The silence in the room was heavy. Then, in a trembling voice, she whispered, "They left, sir. All of them. 2 weeks ago." "What?" Ethan's tone hardened. "Left? Without notice?" She nodded slowly. "They said they couldn't handle it anymore. He needed too much care. So they quit. I tried to contact your office, sir, but—" She paused, eyes glistening. "They said you were too busy to take calls." For a moment, the mighty billionaire felt smaller than ever. He looked at his father, weak, pale, barely able to lift his hands, and realized how far away he'd truly been. Grace knelt again, gently pulling the blanket over Robert's shoulders. "He's been asking for you every day," she said softly, even when he could barely speak. Ethan's lips parted, but no sound came out. The lump in his throat was unbearable. Robert smiled faintly and said, "Don't be angry at her, son. If not for Grace, I wouldn't still be here." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. The guilt hit him like a tidal wave. In all his years of success, he had forgotten the man who built him, and the people who truly cared. He sank to one knee beside his father, his voice cracking. "Dad, I'm so sorry." Grace quietly turned away, giving them space. And as Ethan held his father's frail hand, he realized, sometimes, coming home isn't about returning to a place. It's about rediscovering what your heart left behind. For a long moment, Ethan stood there frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, barely even breathing. The scene before him felt unreal, almost dreamlike. His once strong father, the man who built an empire from nothing, sat trembling in a worn armchair, and beside him, a simple maid was kneeling with tears in her eyes. The billionaire who owned half the city suddenly felt like a stranger in his own home. Grace's hands shook as she reached for the fallen spoon. The soup had spilled slightly onto the rug, but she didn't care about that. Her eyes were locked on Ethan's cold, unreadable face. "And Mr. Ethan," she whispered, voice trembling. "I didn't expect you to come back so soon." Ethan blinked, his chest tightening. So soon? He hadn't come home in years. What is going on here? His voice was low, but it carried weight, the kind of tone that made his employees fall silent in meetings. Grace hesitated, her lips quivering. "Sir, your father was feeling weak. He hasn't been able to feed himself properly for some time now." Ethan frowned. "That's why I hired nurses. Professional caregivers. Where are they?" Grace looked down at the floor. The quiet in the room was so heavy that even the ticking of the wall clock sounded deafening. "They left, sir," she said softly. "What do you mean, left?" Ethan's tone sharpened. "I paid them well. They had everything they needed." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "They said they couldn't handle it anymore, sir. Your father's condition got worse. He needed constant attention, every hour, every night. They just—" She paused, choking on her words. "They just walked away." Ethan's anger began to rise, not just at the nurses, but at himself. He clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. "And you didn't think to contact me?" he snapped. "I did, sir," Grace said quietly. "Many times. I called, I emailed your assistant, I even wrote letters. But they said you were traveling for business, that you couldn't be disturbed." Her voice cracked. "He was getting worse each day, and I didn't know what else to do." Ethan turned away, his chest heaving with emotion. Guilt and disbelief twisted inside him like knives. He walked over to his father's chair. The man who had once been full of strength and laughter now looked fragile, like a shadow of the man he once knew. His eyes were pale, tired, but still full of that gentle wisdom Ethan had grown up admiring. Robert King smiled faintly when he saw his son kneel beside him. "You came back, son," he whispered. "I knew you would." Ethan swallowed hard. forcing a smile through the tightness in his throat. Of course I did, Dad. I just didn't expect to see. He hesitated, glancing at Grace. This. Robert's smile didn't fade. Grace has been taking care of me. She's been my angel. Grace shook her head quickly, wiping her tears. Please, sir, don't say that. But Robert insisted, his trembling hand reaching for hers. No, Grace. It's the truth. You've done more for me than anyone ever has. Ethan felt his chest tighten again. There was gratitude in his father's eyes, the same eyes that once looked at him with pride. But now, behind that gratitude, there was something else too, disappointment. Grace stood silently, unsure whether to stay or leave. She didn't want to make Ethan uncomfortable. He was, after all, her employer, and the most powerful man she'd ever met. I'll go prepare his medicine, she said softly, beginning to walk away. But Robert gripped her hand weakly. Stay, he whispered. She froze, looking between father and son. Ethan noticed the way his father's thin fingers clung to Grace's hand, and for the first time, he saw not a maid, but a person who had stayed behind when everyone else had left. Robert looked at Ethan, his voice trembling but clear. Son, if not for her, I wouldn't still be here. You hired people with degrees and uniforms, but when things got hard, they ran. Grace stayed. Grace lowered her head, embarrassed. I couldn't just walk away, sir. Your father needed someone. Ethan felt a rush of emotions, guilt, confusion, and a strange warmth he hadn't felt in years. Why? He asked quietly. You could have left too. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the edge of her apron. Because he wasn't just my employer. He treated me like I mattered. When I first came here, I was lost, broke, alone, trying to survive. But Mr. Robert always spoke to me kindly. He'd ask about my day, share stories from his youth. No one else ever did that. Her voice wavered as she continued. When he got sick, I couldn't watch him suffer. I don't have a family of my own anymore, sir, so he became like one. Ethan didn't know what to say. He just stood there, staring at her. This quiet, humble woman who had done more out of love than he had with all his wealth. He thought about the countless deals he had closed, the millions he had made, the awards and magazine covers, and realized none of it could compare to the simple kindness Grace had shown. That he felt ashamed, in a low voice. Almost to himself, he murmured, all this time, I thought money could buy the best care, the best help. But I was wrong. Grace shook her head gently. It's not your fault, sir. You did what you thought was right. But Ethan didn't believe her. He felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had given his father wealth, but not presents. Comfort, but not care. That he looked around the room again. The grand furniture, the paintings, the glowing chandelier. Everything looked beautiful, yet lifeless. And then he looked at Grace, kneeling beside his father again, feeding him slowly, whispering words of comfort. That it hit him. This was what real wealth looked like. Not gold or stocks or fame, but compassion. Robert coughed weakly, pulling Ethan's attention back to him. Son, he said softly, do you remember what I used to tell you when you were little? Ethan nodded slowly. You said, a good heart is the only thing worth keeping when everything else fades. Robert smiled faintly. And now you see it. Grace has that heart. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but his father's hand tightened around his. Don't blame yourself, Robert whispered. Just learn from this. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Grace stood quietly beside them, watching the bond between father and son begin to mend. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was healing. That night, as Ethan left his father's room, he turned back one last time. Grace was sitting beside Robert again, gently humming a lullaby as he drifted to sleep. The billionaire paused at the doorway, his eyes soft. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man of power. He felt like a son who had finally understood the meaning of love. He whispered under his breath, "Thank you, Grace." And as he walked down the long, quiet hall, he realized that the most shocking thing he had seen that day wasn't Grace feeding his father. It was the reminder that money builds houses, but love builds homes. The night settled over the King mansion like a heavy blanket. Rain began to tap softly against the wide glass windows, a rhythm that matched the uneven beating of Ethan's heart. He sat alone in his father's study. The same room that once smelled of cigar smoke and coffee. The same place where he had watched Robert King sign his first business deal. Now the room smelled of medicine, damp wood, and quiet sorrow. Grace had stepped out to prepare tea, leaving Ethan and his father alone for the first time in years. Ethan stared at the fire crackling weakly in the fireplace. "Dad," he began, his voice low. "Why didn't you tell me how bad things had gotten?" Robert leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling as he adjusted the blanket on his lap. "You were busy building your world, son. I didn't want to be another problem on your list." Ethan winced. "You're not a problem, Dad. You're the reason I worked so hard in the first place." Robert gave a tired chuckle that turned into a cough. "Hard work is good, Ethan. But if it costs you people, it costs too much." Grace returned quietly, placing 2 cups of steaming tea on the table. The smell of chamomile filled the room. She spoke softly, not wanting to interrupt. "Mr. Robert, your medicine will be ready soon." He smiled faintly. "Thank you, Grace." Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You mentioned earlier that the nurses left. When exactly?" She hesitated. "Almost 3 weeks ago, sir." Ethan's eyes widened. 3 weeks. And you've been taking care of him alone all this time?" Grace nodded. "It wasn't easy, but I couldn't leave him like that. You should have told me." Ethan said sharply, frustration rising in his tone. Grace flinched at the sound, lowering her head. "I tried, sir. I really did. I left voicemails. I sent emails. I even spoke to someone at your company, a woman named Clara. She said you were in negotiations in London and couldn't be disturbed." Ethan rubbed his temples. Clara was his executive assistant, efficient but cold. He had told her to block all personal matters during the merger. All personal matters. His chest tightened with guilt. "So you decided to play nurse?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but still edged with disbelief. Grace met his gaze for the first time, her dark eyes glistening. "Not play, sir. I used to be one, before life changed." Ethan blinked. "You were a nurse?" She nodded slowly. "In a small clinic outside the city. But when my husband passed away and I couldn't afford the bills, I had to leave that job. The King family was kind enough to hire me as a maid. I never imagined I'd use those skills again, until Mr. Robert fell sick." The words hung in the air, soft but powerful. That Ethan's anger dissolved, replaced by something deeper, humility. "You could have gone back to nursing," he murmured. Grace smiled sadly. "It's not easy to rebuild when the world forgets you exist, sir." Robert watched silently, a faint smile touching his lips. "You see, Ethan? Money may hire hands, but only hearts choose to stay." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I should have been here. I should have known." Grace shook her head gently. "Your father never blamed you. Even on the hardest nights," he said, "my boy is out there chasing dreams. That's what I taught him to do." Ethan turned toward his father, tears brimming. "You defended me even when I didn't deserve it." Robert reached out, placing a trembling hand on his son's wrist. "That's what fathers do." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy with emotion, with everything that had been left unsaid for years. Grace poured a cup of tea for Robert and helped him lift it to his lips. Ethan watched in silence, noticing how her hands moved with care. Gentle, practiced, full of compassion. He remembered the cold professionalism of the private nurses he'd hired, the ones who treated his father like a task, not a person. "Dad," Ethan whispered, "why didn't you tell me they left? I could have sent new ones." Robert smiled faintly. "Because I didn't need new ones. I had Grace." Grace blushed, embarrassed. "Please, sir, don't say that." But Robert kept smiling. "She gave me something no money could buy, peace." Ethan's throat tightened again. "Peace?" "Yes," his father said softly. "When you grow old, you don't need luxury. You need warmth. Someone to talk to. Someone who listens when the house gets too quiet." Those words sank deep into Ethan's heart like stones sinking into water. A log cracked in the fireplace. The rain outside grew heavier, thunder rolling softly in the distance. Grace rose quietly to check the windows, closing them before the wind could blow out the flame. Ethan watched her, this woman who had carried his father's pain alone, who had filled the silence of this mansion when he couldn't. When she turned back, he asked gently, "Grace, why didn't you ever ask for help? For money? For support?" She gave a small smile. "Because sometimes, sir, it's not about what you can get. It's about what's right. Her eyes softened. Your father reminded me of my own. Kind, patient, always asking if I'd eaten. When he started losing strength, I promised myself I wouldn't let him feel abandoned. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. And you stayed true to that promise. Grace nodded. Every night, I'd sit by his bed and pray he'd wake up in the morning. Sometimes I'd talk to him even when he couldn't hear me. I told him stories, read him the newspaper, made him laugh when I could. I wanted him to feel like he wasn't alone. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she added, "We may not share blood, sir, but sometimes love chooses its own family." For a long while, no one spoke. The only sound was the rain. Ethan stood, walking to the window. He looked out at the garden, the same garden where he'd played as a boy while his father watched proudly from the porch. Now the flowers were overgrown, the lights dim, the pathways slick with rain. He realized how much time had passed, how much he'd missed. He turned back to his father, his voice breaking. "Dad, I built empires, but I couldn't even be here when you needed me most." Robert's eyes softened. "You came back. That's what matters." "But it's too late," Ethan said bitterly. "Never," his father whispered. "The heart doesn't count years, son. It counts moments, and this one still belongs to you." Ethan couldn't hold it anymore. He knelt beside his father's chair and hugged him tightly, for the first time in years. Robert's frail hands patted his back, comforting him like he was still that little boy who scraped his knees in the garden. Grace turned away, quietly wiping her tears. When Ethan finally pulled back, Robert looked at him seriously. "Promise me something, Ethan. Anything, Dad. When I'm gone, don't fill this house with strangers. Fill it with kindness. The world needs more hearts like hers," he said, nodding toward Grace. Ethan followed his father's gaze and met Grace's tearful eyes. He nodded slowly. "I will, Dad. I promise." Robert smiled weakly. "Then I can rest easy." Grace placed her hand over Robert's gently. "You will rest, sir, and you'll wake up stronger tomorrow." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion. For the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel empty. It felt alive, not because of wealth, but because of loved as. The rain finally eased outside. Ethan whispered to himself, "Sometimes the richest people are the ones who give without having anything to lose." And that night, the bitter truth sank in. All the power, all the money, all the success meant nothing, because compassion, not currency, was the true measure of wealth. The next morning arrived quietly. Soft rays of sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the King mansion, painting thin golden lines across the wooden floor. The storm from the night before had passed, but its memory still lingered in the damp air. Ethan hadn't slept much. He'd spent the night in the guest room, restless, his mind replaying every moment from the evening before. His father's frail voice, Grace's trembling hands, her words about staying when everyone else had left. Now, as he stood before the mirror buttoning his shirt, he saw someone different staring back at him. Not the polished billionaire the media adored, but a man who had forgotten how to feel. That he sighed, straightened his collar, and walked downstairs. The smell of porridge and herbal tea drifted from the kitchen. He followed it, his footsteps soft against the marble floor. Inside, Grace stood at the stove wearing her simple gray uniform, humming softly to herself. There was something peaceful about her presence, the way she moved with care, the way she made even the smallest tasks feel sacred. She turned when she heard him. "Good morning, sir." Ethan nodded, awkwardly clearing his throat. "Morning, Grace. How's my father?" Her smile was gentle. "He's better today. He slept through the night for the first time in weeks." "That's good," Ethan said, relief washing over him. "You should take a break. You've been working nonstop." Grace shook her head lightly. "Rest can wait, sir. Breakfast can't." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. Later that morning, they sat in the garden, the same garden where Ethan had played as a child. Robert rested in his wheelchair, a blanket over his knees, his face tilted toward the sunlight. Grace sat beside him, reading softly from a book. Ethan approached quietly, not wanting to disturb the calm. His father opened one eye and grinned. "Look who's finally up." Ethan laughed under his breath. "You sound better already." "I have good company," Robert said, nodding toward Grace. Grace closed the book shyly. He just likes the story because I do all the voices. Ethan raised a brow. Voices? Robert chuckled. You should hear her do Shakespeare. It's better than television. Grace's cheeks flushed with color. Please, don't tease me, sir. Ethan smiled for real this time. But beneath that smile, curiosity stirred. Who was this woman who could make his father laugh after weeks of pain? Who stayed when the world walked away? He waited until evening to find out. The sky turned shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped low. The house was quiet again. Robert was asleep, and Grace was washing dishes in the kitchen. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching her in silence. The water shimmered under the dim light, her reflection rippling on its surface. Grace, he said finally, his voice soft. She jumped slightly, almost dropping a plate. Oh, Mr. Ethan, you scared me. Sorry. He stepped forward. I wanted to talk. She wiped her hands on her apron. Of course, sir. Why did you stay? He asked. Really? I know my father's kind, but this, he gestured toward the house. This isn't your responsibility. Grace hesitated, glancing down. It became one, sir. How? She took a deep breath, her voice trembling just a little. Because once, someone didn't stay for me. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? She leaned against the counter, eyes distant, as if looking back into a world she'd buried long ago. I grew up in a small town, she began quietly. My father was a schoolteacher, gentle, humble, always putting others before himself. When he got sick, I was still studying to be a nurse. We couldn't afford proper treatment. The hospital bills kept rising, and the doctors, her voice cracked. They stopped coming when we couldn't pay anymore. She swallowed hard. One night, he couldn't breathe. I called everyone I knew for help, but no one came. By the time I found a taxi, it was too late. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Grace blinked back tears. Since that night, I promised myself I'd never let anyone's father suffer the way mine did. So when your father's health started to fade, I couldn't walk away. It wasn't just duty, it was redemption. The room went silent except for the faint dripping of the tap. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. You never told anyone that. She shook her head. It wasn't important. What mattered was making sure he was okay. Ethan stepped closer, his expression softening. You gave up your own life to take care of mine. That's not something I can repay. Grace smiled faintly. I didn't do it for payment, sir. I did it because it was right. He studied her quietly, the tired lines around her eyes, the strength in her posture, the calm dignity in her voice. You could have asked for help, he said gently. I did ask, she whispered, but not from you. He tilted his head. From who? Grace smiled sadly. From God. I just prayed he'd send someone to help me care for your father. And when no one came, I realized, maybe he sent me instead. Ethan felt his eyes sting. He had spent his whole life believing money could solve anything. And here was a woman who believed that love could do what money couldn't. The next day, Grace continued her routine, checking Robert's pulse, preparing meals, reading to him. Ethan followed quietly, watching. At one point, Robert looked up and said, You two make a good team. Ethan chuckled. She's the real boss here. Grace laughed softly. Don't say that, sir. You're both my bosses. Robert smiled knowingly. No, Grace. Your family. The word family hit Ethan harder than he expected. Family. That was something his wealth had bought less and less of. Later, when Robert took his afternoon nap, Ethan and Grace sat outside on the porch. The garden glowed under the late afternoon sun. Birds fluttered among the roses. You know, Ethan said, when I first saw you feeding my father, I thought it was wrong. I thought you were overstepping. But now I realize you were the only one doing what I should have done. Grace shook her head gently. Don't punish yourself, sir. Everyone fights their own battles. Yours just looked different. He smiled weakly. Still, I owe you an apology. Accepted, she said softly. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind in the trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Robert called out faintly from his room. Grace stood up instantly. He's awake. I'll get his medicine. Ethan watched her hurry inside, her figure framed by the golden light. For the first time, he realized something he hadn't before. Grace didn't just serve his father. She understood him. He followed quietly and found her adjusting the pillows behind Robert, helping him drink his medicine with the same gentle patience she always had. Robert caught Ethan's gaze and smiled. See, son, angels don't always wear wings. Grace blushed. Please, Mr. Robert. But Ethan nodded slowly. He's right. Robert chuckled softly. Told you. Then he closed his eyes, drifting back to sleep, still smiling. Ethan stood there, watching Grace smooth the blanket over his father's chest. Something in him shifted, something deep and permanent. For years, he had chased success thinking it would fill the emptiness inside him. But now, standing beside this humble woman who had given everything for someone else's father, he finally understood what true success meant. It wasn't about the empire he'd built. It was about the heart he'd forgotten to use. That night, as Grace turned off the lights and whispered a soft prayer beside Robert's bed, Ethan lingered at the doorway as he listened to her gentle voice, to the sincerity in every word. And for the first time in his adult life, the billionaire closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in gratitude that he realized Grace's secret wasn't just about her past. It was about her heart, a heart that healed others while quietly carrying its own scars. And from that moment on, Ethan knew his life would never be the same again. That night was different. The air inside the mansion was unusually still, heavy with silence. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed slower, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. Grace sat beside Robert's bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, reading him his favorite psalm in a soft voice. Ethan lingered at the doorway, watching the scene unfold. That it had been 3 days since their deep conversation in the kitchen, and in those 3 days, something had changed between them. Ethan had started helping, bringing his father's medicine, serving meals, sometimes even joining Grace during her late-night checks. He didn't say much, but every small act of care spoke louder than words. Tonight, though, Robert looked weaker than usual. His breathing came slower, each inhale a little more strained than the last. Grace noticed it first. She gently closed the book. Mr. Robert, should I call the doctor? Robert shook his head weakly. No, my dear, no doctors tonight. Ethan frowned and stepped closer. Dad, don't say that. You need rest. We can. But Robert raised a trembling hand. Ethan, son, come sit. There was something in his tone, firm yet soft, that silenced Ethan instantly. He pulled a chair close to the bed. Grace reached for the glass of water, helping Robert take a slow sip. Then she sat back, quietly, sensing something important was about to be said. Robert looked from his son to Grace, his tired eyes filled with both love and guilt. I don't have much strength left, he said slowly. And there's something I need to say before I can rest easy. Ethan leaned forward. Don't talk like that, Dad. You'll be fine. Robert gave a faint smile. Son, I've lived long enough to know when goodbye is near. But before I go, I need you to know the truth about Grace. Ethan turned sharply toward her, confused. What about her? Grace's eyes widened. Mr. Robert, please, you don't have to. But Robert shook his head. He deserves to know. He took a long breath, his voice shaking as memories came flooding back. Ethan, he began. You remember the factory fire 20 years ago? Ethan nodded slowly. Of course. It was in all the papers. One of our company warehouses caught fire. You saved 2 workers that day. Robert smiled sadly. Yes, but I couldn't save the third. Grace looked down, her fingers trembling slightly. Robert continued, his eyes glistening. The man I couldn't save, his name was Samuel. He was one of my oldest, most loyal workers. Humble, honest, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. He was also. He paused, looking directly at Grace. Her father. The room fell silent. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What? Robert nodded slowly. Grace's father died that day because of me. Grace shook her head quickly, tears filling her eyes. No, sir, it wasn't your fault. The fire. Robert raised his hand gently. Please, Grace, let me speak. He turned back to Ethan. I was the one who ordered the night shift. I was warned about the faulty wiring, but I ignored it. I thought fixing it could wait another week. I wanted to meet production deadlines, save costs. Ethan's eyes widened. You knew? Robert nodded, shame clouding his face. Yes, and because of my negligence, the warehouse caught fire. Samuel was trapped inside. Grace covered her mouth, tears streaming silently. Robert's voice grew hoarse. When I learned he didn't make it, I went to his family to beg for forgiveness. His wife, Grace's mother, refused to even see me. They lost everything after that. The compensation I offered couldn't bring back the man they loved. So I left, carrying that guilt for years. He turned his gaze toward Grace, trembling. When your mother passed, you came to work here, and I didn't even recognize you at first. You were just a quiet young woman trying to find work. But the day I realized who you were, I tried to let you go. Grace nodded slowly. Yes, I remember. You said the job might not be right for me, but I begged you to let me stay. Robert's voice broke. Because you wanted to take care of me, the man who ruined your family. I didn't understand it. I thought you stayed out of pity. But over time, I saw that you cared genuinely. You forgave me long before I forgave myself. Ethan sat frozen, unable to speak. His mind raced back through every moment he had seen Grace with his father. The patience, the kindness, the tears she hid when Robert was in pain. All of it made sense now. Grace, he whispered, his voice trembling. You knew all along? You knew he caused your father's death. She nodded slowly, wiping her cheeks. I found out a few years after I started working here. I recognized his voice, his stories, and one day, I saw the old photograph in his study. My father was in it, standing beside him. That's when I knew. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. And you still stayed? Grace met his gaze, her eyes filled with quiet strength. Yes, because hate would have destroyed me. Forgiveness gave me peace. I realized Mr. Robert was already punishing himself every day. I didn't need to add to his pain. I just wanted to bring light where there was darkness. Robert's voice trembled as he reached for her hand. You brought more than light, Grace. You brought redemption. Tears slipped down Ethan's face. He took his father's other hand. Dad, why didn't you tell me? Robert smiled weakly. Because I didn't deserve forgiveness. Not from her, and not from you. But Grace taught me something, son. She taught me that love is not about forgetting the past. It's about healing through it. Ethan squeezed his hand. You did what you could, Dad. You made mistakes, but you tried to make them right. Robert looked at his son and then at Grace. I want you both to promise me something. Ethan leaned closer. Anything. When I'm gone, don't let guilt separate you. You've both carried too much pain already. Promise me you'll live, not in regret, but in gratitude. Ethan's voice cracked. I promise. Grace nodded through tears. So do I. Robert smiled, a faint, peaceful smile. Good, that's all a father could ask for. The room was filled with quiet sobs. Grace gently wiped Robert's forehead, whispering a soft prayer. Moments later, Robert whispered, Grace, thank you for forgiving me. And Ethan, thank you for coming home. His eyes fluttered shut. His breathing slowed. For a moment, time stopped. Then came the silence. A silence so deep, it wrapped around the entire house like a heavy blanket. Ethan bowed his head, tears falling freely. Grace rested her hand over Robert's, whispering, Rest now, sir. You're forgiven. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently, as if nature itself was mourning a soul finally at peace. That night, Ethan sat in the garden alone, staring at the stars. Grace joined him quietly, a blanket around her shoulders. After a long silence, she said softly, He found peace tonight. Ethan nodded, and he gave me a reason to change. Grace looked at him. What will you do now? Ethan turned to her, his eyes gentle. I'll live the way he wanted me to. Not as a billionaire, but as a man my father would be proud of. Grace smiled faintly, a tear slipping down her cheek. He already was. The two sat in silence, the stars above them shining brighter than ever before, like a message from Robert himself, reminding them that forgiveness is the greatest wealth of all. The morning after Robert King's passing was unlike any other. The mansion, once filled with the quiet rhythm of his breathing, now felt hollow, every room echoing with absence. Outside, dawn broke softly. Golden sunlight brushed across the garden, where dew clung to every leaf like tears that refused to fall. Birds sang, but even their songs seemed muted, gentle, respectful of the peace that now enveloped the old man's home. Inside, Ethan stood at the window of his father's study. The same study where his father had signed contracts, written letters, and built his empire. But now, the desk was empty. Except for a photograph that it was an old, faded picture of Robert shaking hands with a man in a factory uniform. Samuel, Grace's father. Ethan picked it up slowly. His reflection trembled against the glass. "Dad," he whispered, "I understand now." Behind him, soft footsteps echoed. Grace entered quietly, dressed in a simple black dress. Her eyes were red from crying, yet calm, like someone who had learned to carry both pain and peace at once. "The funeral service is ready," she said softly. "Would you like to come down?" Ethan nodded, setting the photo back on the desk. "Yes, it's time." The service was small. Just a few old business associates, some workers from the factory, and a handful of neighbors. Ethan didn't want a grand ceremony. His father would have hated that. He wanted something humble, something real. The casket rested under the large oak tree in the garden, the same place Robert had loved to sit every morning. A gentle wind rustled the leaves, scattering petals over the polished wood. Ethan stood before the crowd, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded a piece of paper. But halfway through, he stopped reading that he looked up, his voice breaking. "My father wasn't perfect," he began. "He made mistakes, some that cost him more than money ever could. But he spent his last years trying to fix what he broke, to give back what he took. And thanks to Grace," he turned toward her, tears in his eyes. "He left this world at peace." Grace lowered her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Ethan continued, his tone soft but strong. "He taught me that success isn't measured in buildings, cars, or bank accounts. It's measured in the hearts you heal, the people you love, and the forgiveness you give." He took a deep breath. "Today, I'm not just saying goodbye to my father. I'm saying goodbye to the man I used to be, the man who believed money was everything." A long silence followed, filled with emotion. Then Ethan placed a white rose on the casket. "Rest well, Dad. You've finally come home." That evening, when everyone had left, Ethan and Grace stayed behind. The sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, bathing the garden in golden light. But Robert's grave was simple, just as he had wanted. The headstone read, "Robert King, a man redeemed by love." Grace knelt beside it, laying down a small bunch of lilies. "He would have loved this," she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. "He would have told us the lilies were too expensive." Grace chuckled softly, and then secretly bought them anyway. They both laughed, a fragile, healing kind of laughter that comes after long tears. Then silence returned, the peaceful kind that doesn't hurt anymore. After a long pause, Ethan turned to her. "Grace, I need to ask you something." She looked at him, waiting. "I don't want to go back to the city," he said quietly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Why not, sir?" "Because for the first time," he said, his voice steady, "I found something worth staying for." Grace's heart skipped. "You mean this house?" He shook his head gently. "No, I mean what this house became. A place of forgiveness. A place you built." She looked down, unsure what to say. Ethan continued, his tone filled with quiet determination. "I want to rebuild my father's company, not as a billionaire's empire, but as a foundation that helps the families of our workers. People like your father, people who were forgotten." Grace's eyes widened. "That's a beautiful idea. It's the least I can do," Ethan said softly. "I want to call it the Samuel Foundation, in honor of your father." Her lips trembled. "You do that? For him? For both of you?" Ethan replied. "Because your forgiveness changed us. It changed me." Tears streamed down Grace's cheeks again, but this time, they were tears of healing. "Thank you," she whispered. "He would be proud." Ethan smiled. "Then let's make him proud together." Over the next few months, the mansion transformed. The quiet halls filled again, not with wealth or luxury, but with purpose. The old study became the foundation's office. Grace managed the welfare projects. Ethan handled the finances. They worked side by side every day, learning, rebuilding, and restoring lives. The first project was a medical fund for workers' families who couldn't afford treatment. Grace's idea. The second was a school sponsorship for children from poor neighborhoods. Ethan's idea. Together, they built something that wasn't about profit, but people. Every wall in the house began to tell a new story of kindness, hope, and second chances. One evening, 6 months later, Ethan found himself standing in the same garden where everything had begun. The same garden where he once saw Grace feeding his father. The air was calm. The roses were in full bloom. He turned as he heard Grace's footsteps behind him. She was holding a tray with 2 cups of tea, smiling softly. "Still working this late?" she teased. He grinned. Old habits. Hard to break. She handed him a cup and sat beside him on the bench. For a while, they just watched the sunset together, the sky painted in orange and pink hues, just like the night his father had died. Grace broke the silence. Do you ever think about him? Ethan nodded. Every day? But it doesn't hurt anymore. It feels peaceful. Grace smiled. He'd be proud of you. Ethan turned to her, his gaze tender. He'd be proud of us. You've done more for this family than anyone ever could. She blushed slightly, looking down at her tea. I only did what was right. Ethan smiled gently. Grace, you've spent your whole life doing what's right for others. Maybe it's time you let someone care for you. Her eyes lifted to his, surprised. The sincerity in his voice made her heart fluttered. He continued. You once told me that God didn't send anyone to help your father. That maybe he sent you instead. But Grace, I think maybe he sent you for us all. For my father, and for me. Grace's lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, he smiled softly. I'm not asking for an answer now. Just know, this house isn't just my home anymore. It's yours too. Always. Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. Then I'll stay, not as a maid this time, but as someone who believes in your father's dream. Ethan nodded. Then we'll build that dream together. As the last light faded from the sky, the wind carried the faint scent of lilies from Robert's grave. It felt like a blessing, a silent approval from a soul finally at peace. Grace and Ethan sat together, their hands brushing gently, the stars beginning to twinkle above them. For the first time, there was no grief, no guilt, no shadows, only gratitude. And somewhere, in that vast, golden silence, it was as if Robert King himself whispered through the wind. Forgiveness is the bridge between sorrow and peace, and love is the home you find on the other side. Months later, a new sign stood proudly outside the mansion gates. For those who deserve a second chance. People came from miles away for help, for guidance, for hope. And every time Grace saw a child smile or a father get treatment he couldn't afford, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for her father, but for the man who once made a terrible mistake, and the son who turned that mistake into a miracle.